Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. For the last 2 weeks, Toronto has been taken over, at least downtown Toronto has been taken over by Taylor Swift. And there was a really interesting article in the paper about the economic opportunities that were created by Taylor Swift by a gentleman that should know because he's the manager of economic research at the DIAS at Toronto Metropolitan University. Please welcome to our show, Viet Vu. Viet, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So why did you write a story, an article in the paper about Taylor Swift?
So the story is actually a little bit longer than you think it is. Last year, when she was just starting her tour, this Eras tour that she has been on now for more than a year, a reporter at a magazine in Canada called The Logic, which focused on sort of technology news, actually got an assignment to write an article about Taylor Swift. Now, she had a whole bunch of sources, and one of the sources happened to be my friend. And instead of answering the interviews, she knew that I love Taylor Swift. I've done all of these kinds of stuff before, and she actually punted the interview request to me. And so that was the first time in which I actually engaged the media on what Taylor Swift could mean for the Canadian economy. And then fast forward almost a year, I've been writing a couple of op-eds for the Globe and Mail. And so Ethan, who's the editor, in one of the discussions on an unrelated op-ed, mentioned offhand that, hey, I'll need someone to write an op-ed about Taylor Swift most likely when she comes to town. And that's kind of where it went from.
Now, I understand that you actually traveled to London, England to see Taylor Swift.
That's right. Unfortunately, it didn't count as a journalistic trip, so I couldn't expense all the tickets or anything like that.
But what was the experience like? You went to Wembley, I presume.
Yeah, so as it relates to the op-ed, it was actually extremely revealing. Up until the moment, so like last August, or this just August that just passed, that I went to the concert, I actually didn't know what direction I was going to take the op-ed. And yet, the moment I landed in London, the week that I spent there, sort of surrounded by Swifties who really, in the best sense of the word, took over London, and then going to a concert, it really remarked upon me what her economic force was. I mean, London is a world-class city, right? It has many things going for it. It has hundreds of years of history and this rich cultural fabric that means that it can stand on its own. And yet, during the week that Taylor Swift was in town, everything that was happening in London related to Taylor Swift. Victoria and Albert Museum, one of the world's most best museum as it relates to sort of culture, fashion, and then the arts, actually held a special exhibit specifically focusing on the costumes of Taylor Swift that ended up meaning that for the first time, I actually used to live in London, so I know how many people go to the V&A, and for the first time in my life, I actually saw a line outside the V&A of people just waiting to get in, not to the concert, but to the exhibit that actually showed Taylor Swift's sort of costumes. And so my thinking went, if a world-class city is one of the world's largest cities, such as London, kind of succumbs to this effect, that also will end up happening in a place like Toronto and Vancouver. And so that's where that idea of not focusing on that immediate economic opportunity that a lot of hotels and restaurants seem to be partaking in, but much more on that reputational aspect about our ability to host an event of this caliber, akin to something like a World Cup or the Olympics, really came to mind.
So the immediate economic impact I read in the paper was 245 million over the
About
course of the 2 weekends.
282, but in that ballpark, yeah.
And so you think that's real?
So I think that that number needs to be contextualized, right? And I think that number, there is a realness to it. I mean, if you go on any sort of hotel booking website, trying to book a hotel in Vancouver right now, and you realize that you'll be paying 3 or 4 times what you would normally pay for a hotel. Same deal where a lot of restaurants are filled with Swifties because a lot of Swifties actually travel to these cities. They spend multiple days in a city that they otherwise would not be going to. And so a lot of these economic opportunities are real. But as an economist, you always talk about the idea of opportunity cost. The reality is, as successful as Taylor Swift's sort of Eras tour has been, not many artists have been able to replicate her success. many artists who plant stadium tours actually had to scale back their sort of the capacity or the venue because they couldn't actually sell as many tickets as they wanted to. And so, yes, that $282 million is probably a right number in the ballpark. But that money isn't just appearing out of thin air, right? That means that it's actually taking money away from somewhere else, from other artists that might be performing in Toronto at the same time. That might be, instead of going to Taylor Swift concert, they might be going to a ball game, or, well, a ball game isn't happening anymore, but let's say a hockey match that's happening in Maple Leaf Garden. Now you don't go because you think, oh, downtown is going to be crazy. And so I do think that 282 million needs to be contextualized a tiny bit.
So I actually went to Taylor Swift the third show last Saturday, and there was a Maple Leafs game on at the same time, and the downtown Toronto streets were packed with people with Edmonton Oilers jerseys and Toronto Maple Leaf jerseys on, and so it didn't take any demand away. It would appear from the hockey game, and I was in a hotel lobby restaurant after, and it was packed with people. And I chatted with a few people, and they were from Los Angeles, they were from San Francisco, they were from Nashville, Tennessee. I didn't meet one person from Ontario in that, and I was shocked, frankly, that the hotel had closed up its kitchen at 11:30. So all these people came back, wanted something to eat, and stupidly, or whatever, the hotel didn't stay open to feed them. They would have made a whole bunch more money. But the economic impact certainly seemed real to me.
I'm not saying that it's not real, but there's also a whole bunch of costs that are associated with hosting such an event, right? I mean, the entirety of downtown was, I think, placed under a special restriction zone where taxis or Ubers can't really pick people up directly at the stadium. There were also costs that related to security. Taylor Swift needed to be escorted directly from the airport to the stadium because I'm sure that the city was thinking very much about what kind of news story it would sort of like project to the world if Taylor Swift ended up being stuck in traffic and didn't make it to a concert in time. And then there's all sorts of associated costs to ensure everyone who were in the area, those who went to the concert, those who were perhaps tailgating, those who went to the Maple Leaf game, were actually safe. And there's actually really terrible precedents that relate to this. We have a concert in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil where one fan actually passed away because of sort of heat exposure and heat stroke. We also had an entire concert in Vienna that was canceled because of a credible terrorist threat. And so even though all of these economic value is there, and so my first argument that I made earlier was that, hey, there's a chunk of this money that's actually taken away from somewhere else. There are also all of these associated costs to delivering these kinds of events that make the net benefit a little bit more dubious, and it's not something that I think we should be focusing on.
But you said that in addition, it's a positive from an image standpoint. Explain that if you could.
That's exactly it. So my argument is that instead of focusing on that sort of top line dollar figure, we need to be thinking about something that is a little bit more intangible, which is about the reputational aspect of it. Toronto and Vancouver next year is going to be hosting a World Cup. Vancouver, just about 14 years ago, hosted a fairly successful Olympics. All of these events bring people, as you mentioned, from everywhere. I met a couple from Vermont. You saw people from Los Angeles, from New York. For a lot of these people, this is their first opportunity interacting with Toronto. This is going to form the image of what the city is. And if we want to be a serious city, which we should be, we are the fifth, Toronto is the fifth largest city in North America. We need to be able to convince people that we can actually operate and run these kinds of events smoothly. And once we're able to build that reputation, those large opportunities, the World Cup, hey, maybe we are now prepared to host the World Cup. And so there's a lot more trust in our government and private vendors to be hosting this, but also other massive opportunities might also come our city's way as well.
I think you're right. I got to ask you, I was really surprised at how welcoming the police were and all of the event staff. As I said, I went
sure
last
it's a
Saturday.
crowd that is slightly less rowdy than what they're normally used to.
No, I think so. But the police were wearing and trading friendship bracelets. They were wearing pink hats. There were friendship bracelets around the mounted police. the event staff were saying, "Have a great night." I've never had event staff welcome me down the lines, the queues, and into the securities that were so welcoming. So someone must have done a big speech. This is Toronto on the international stage. Be a lot nicer than usual.
No, 100% right. And quite frankly and quite honestly, I do think the fact that there are a lot more children who are going to be attending, a lot more young girls in particular who are attending a Taylor Swift concert, probably also has something to do with it. That actually breeds one of the most important sort of democratic forces that actually impacts the economy in my mind, which is about this idea of social trust, right? You walking around downtown on a concert night, interacting with a random sort of Swiftie, know that that interaction is going to be pleasant. Know that that interaction is going to be positive, and maybe you'll exchange a friendship bracelet or you're going to make a new friend. And I do think that that force of Taylor Swift is another thing that like I really, really want to talk about on how she does bring so many people together in such a positive, joy-filled sort of environment. And I certainly need a lot of joy after the past couple of years. I'm sure you do as well. And I think the world needs a bit more of that.
I traded 50 bracelets. I'm
That's
not
incredible.
I'm not that kind of guy, but I did. I had a bright pink jacket on and I traded for 50 bracelets. And these young ladies, these young girls were so excited to trade bracelets with me. What's going on?
Look, I think a lot of cultural studies scholars will be studying the phenomenon about Taylor Swift for a long, long time. And I'm an economist, not a cultural studies scholar, but my guess is that there's something that relates to one of my cultural background. And so I'm Japanese Vietnamese, and it's a Japanese part of me that I want to talk about because in Japan, we have this concept of a kind of celebrity called an idol. And an idol sings, acts, hosts sort of TV shows, does photo sessions and fan meets. They're not about any single piece of art that they engage in, but much more about creating an image of themselves that is larger than themselves, and about fostering a community of fans that are based around this image, this being that the idol is, that might be quite different from the person it actually is. And that concept of an idol, I don't think existed really in our generation in the West. That was very much like an East Asian concept, right? You see sort of J-pop and K-pop stars that create these kinds of images and personas that so many people can relate to. And don't get me wrong, Taylor Swift is a brilliant artist. Her impact on sort of singer-songwriter genre will be felt, but she's much more than that. She manages to connect with her fans in such a way that she creates this image of herself. And so that's what I sort of argue that she's kind of our generation's Western idol that so many people can relate to, can see themselves in her. And so many don't even need to interact with her. They just need to be in the same space, speak the same language, be part of that community, which I do think is a magic about who she is.
I went to Bruce Springsteen 3 weeks ago, and he sold out the hockey arena. And Bruce Springsteen was my hero when I was a teenager, young adult, and I loved the music and I loved the songs, and I knew most of them and I knew most of the words. But it was one night in a hockey arena. Taylor Swift was 6 nights in the baseball stadium, and I was surrounded by ladies and girls. So, young girls as well as females in their 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. All of them knew all of the songs and all of the words and sang every single song, every
Yeah,
single word. And,
yeah,
and then she comes on for this acoustic set, which is supposedly 2 surprise songs,
yeah.
and they knew all the songs to the surprise songs.
Yeah, I'll raise one above that, right? Is that in the Eras concert, there are these series of rituals that fans effectively call chants. And so there are things that are kind of rehearsed to an extent that like if you know you know. So I'm sure you've experienced this, but there was a moment in the concert where there was a music box that was wheeled onto the stage, and then when one of the backup dancers opened the box, music started playing and fans started singing along to the song, and then the music box closed, the music stopped for a second, everyone goes silent, and then the music box opens again, and everyone starts singing again. In the Eras Tour, there are dozens and dozens of chants like that. That is sort of things that allows this concert to be so interactive, right? Because it's not just about Taylor Swift singing to you and experiencing music. She very much curates her sort of concert to be one that every fan, regardless of whether you have a floor seat or if you're up in the nosebleeds, can actually enjoy yourself because you are participating in it. You, I'm sure, also experienced the moment after Champagne Problems, after she played her Evermore set, where what's called a standing ovation, people thundering in applause and stomping for many minutes. Those are also part of that chant that really allows participants to be actively be part of the concert as opposed to just an observant.
So you think this is because people see her as an idol, they see her as a person, they've got a personal connection with her. It's different than with other performers. Is that what you're saying?
I think what I'm saying is a tiny bit more subtle, which is that perhaps people absolutely see that parasocial relationship, or like it's as if Taylor Swift is your friend. There's part of that, that's for sure. But I think a lot of people also see Taylor Swift as something larger than themselves. She's kind of like I'm not going to say a god or a deity, but someone that is spiritual in that sense, that sort of connects the community. It's perhaps a role model. It's perhaps an image of someone that you strive to be. And so there's so many positive things that you sort of connect with. And crucially, is a common factor between you and the stranger that might be standing right next to you enjoying the same concert, because you've seen her grow. You've seen 14 years or almost 2 decades of her career sort of grow, and then has music evolve, and also see her struggle in a very human way, perhaps. But you see that growth and you connect it to something larger. So I think the point that I'm making is less so that you feel as if you're Taylor Swift's friend, but that Taylor Swift represents an idea of a person that you perhaps strive to be, that you want to support.
That's interesting that you're commenting about seeing her growth and seeing her struggles. I was shocked at how many young men I saw wearing Travis Kelce jerseys. There
Yeah.
seems to be this incredible fascination with her love life. Is that because people have seen her struggle and they're happy that she's happy, or somehow feeling like a personal connection with this person that's finally found what would appear to be more stable, true love?
I mean, I think there's a lot about Taylor Swift's of people's fascination with Taylor Swift's love life that I do think is indicative of our sort of celebrity gossip culture, right? And sometimes that is to the detriment of the celebrity herself, in this case Taylor, because in a lot of ways, dating someone, breaking up with someone, is a fairly traumatic experience, and when you don't get to process that privately, there is going to be a lot of trouble involved, certainly for human growth. And I do think that it's really, really wonderful how Taylor Swift has been able to share part of that struggle with her fans, part of that sort of growth and breakups, and how she sort of processed loss, and how she perhaps learned to love again. But not all of that is actually shared with the fans, because you realize that there was a long-term partner that she was dating prior to the start of the Eras Tour. They actually broke up during the pandemic, but she didn't announce their breakup until basically right before the start of the Eras Tour. And a lot of fans were in fact shocked because they had assumed that they had known this about her. And even that makes her human, right? Because she basically said that, okay, this was a very long-term relationship for me. I needed a lot of time to process before I can share that struggle with the world. But going back to Kelsey, Travis Kelsey, I don't think like the blossoming relationship, certainly the relationship between Travis Kelsey and Taylor Swift, also is a brilliant business decision. I'm not saying that like their relationship is based on business, because I absolutely do believe that their relationship is genuine and is real. But it kind of broadened the audience of who Taylor Swift can be. I mean, how much more American can you get as far as couples go? One who is a Southern sort of like grown up music singer who started with a country route, now is a pop star. On the other is a football player who has many Super Bowl under him. That is sort of an all-American story. And I do think a lot of people, just like how we Canadians get often invested in sort of royal romances, are investing in their relationship because, again, it represents perhaps something larger.
Another thing that really shocked me, surprised me about the event was how many young girls were dressed in outrageously revealing, costumes, dresses, and young ladies dressed, to the hilt, in things that were very revealing. Like it was surprisingly how many people were dressed up in glitter, but in revealing things as well.
Yeah, so I don't think that I'll be able to comment too much on that sort of revealing nature of it, especially if we're talking about young girls, for that is not an area that I focus on. But I do think that it matters what Taylor Swift music has been representing, right? She has been fairly aggressively and openly like professing her belief about the strength of being a woman and being a woman unapologetically. One of the first songs of the Eras Tour set is The Man, where she's literally talking about the fact that if she was a man, she would be the man or kind of the top of her game. Then the fact that she's a woman means that she has to work so much harder to be able to achieve that what she does. And so I do think a lot of her music does represent what it is about being a woman unapologetically. And in terms of sort of dressing up, they're not really dressing up in a revealing sense, I don't think. Specifically commenting on, let's say, adult women dressing up here for the men, because I'm not sure whether you noticed, there aren't a lot of men who go
No, they're
to.
dressing up for each other and themselves.
That's exactly it. And so this is very much, I think, an expression of femininity, an expression of what being a woman is to other women, and being proud of that fact.
I came away by thinking it was about femininity. You're quite right, and also about being proud and successful as a female, which is that first song. But then there's a song where they're dancing with chairs and in revealing costumes, and I think that there's something about being comfortable with sexuality as well.
100%. I mean, that was very much the theme of her maturity, her maturing, right? Of being able to talk about sexuality, of it being able to talk about sex. And also, there are a lot of swear words that show up in a lot of songs. And so it's also about that part of being unapologetic about every part of being a woman. And so again, look, I will say right here that I am a man and I'm talking about women here. And so there are a lot of this that I will defer to women who do comment on these things, who actually study the expressions of femininity and expression of womanhood in the arts. But as a queer man, I definitely felt that positive power and that positive expression of femininity, me on the grounds in London back in August.
Well, I got to tell you, I was not a Swiftie before I went, and I came away a Swiftie after the experience. It was something else. We got to take a break for some messages. We're going to come back in just 2 minutes with Viet Vu, and I'm going to elevate and talk about the economic impact of big events. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes.
No.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Viet Vu. He is the manager of economic research at the DIAS at Toronto Metropolitan University, and he's the author of a recent op-ed in the newspaper about the economic opportunity of the Taylor Swift concerts and what it represents. But he also spoke about and wrote about some of the economic impacts of big events. And so, Viet, I wonder if you could talk about, I remember we were thinking in Toronto about either an expo or an Olympics, and they talked about more bread, less circuses. So there's this whole, one point of view that says that these big events, they end up really, helping corporations and the rich, but they don't end up helping the city. And we'd be rather spending money on social programs for the people that are in need. And then there's this other attitude that says that hockey teams, football teams, Olympics, World Cups, concerts have this huge economic image benefit to a city and economic, short-term economic benefit to the city. Tell me about how you think about that and what research has been done in that regard, if you could.
Yeah, so there are a lot of research that has actually been done that evaluate the cost and benefit of hosting a world-class event, especially because we have a lot of data that concerns around some of the world's largest sort of sporting events in particular. Things like the Olympics, things like the World Cup. And the answer seems to be fairly unanimous that if the only thing that you care about is sort of the positive fiscal impact of those events, you should not be doing it. In Canada, we've had actually a really painful experience with this in Montreal, that was the host to the 1976 Olympics. Right after the Olympics, the city was saddled with almost $1 billion of debt in 1976 dollars, and so you can imagine how much it would be today. And the city actually had to pay that off over the course of 30 years in order to ensure that its fiscal book was in order. And a lot of similar stories of that. Even the 2010 Vancouver Olympics, the entire series of houses that were built to house the Olympians, which is now called the Olympics Village, wonder how they named that, ended up needing to spend about at least more than a decade to actually make back the original sets of investment. And so if what you care about is sort of the positive fiscal impact that comes from this event, you should not be doing it. However, there are a couple of reasons that are really, really big on why you should be doing it. First reason, it's I think quite simple. It's very good for the city, from the sense that if you live in Toronto next year, you don't have to travel all the way to Qatar like 4 years ago or 2 years ago in order to see the World Cup. You actually get to a chance to be able to see it without spending a lot of money. And so the first way that you should be thinking about these large sporting sort of flagship event is sort of as a consumption good. You are sort of rewarding the people that are living in your city that says that, hey, you get an opportunity to be part of this something that is massive. And then the second, which I come back to, just as sort of Taylor Swift concert was, which isn't like any other concert, right? It's at the scale that consumes an entire city, is on that reputational aspect. But there's a bit of a twist to that idea of reputational aspect as well, because if as a city you're hosting these events, you now also has a lever with different levels of government to be lobbying and advocating for necessary infrastructure investments. Vancouver is a prime example of this because it was going to be hosting the 2010 Winter Olympics. It managed to build a subway from the airport right to downtown, where that infrastructure wouldn't actually exist without the city hosting the Olympics. But because the city was hosting the Olympics, it managed to convince the province to chip in, it managed to convince the federal government to chip in, and actually completed this massive infrastructure transit project in time for the opening of the Olympics. And so there is a reputational risk that you can actually advocate for because you're hosting these large events that then attract sort of investment money to build up those infrastructure to handle it. But that ends up being sort of a risk and reward calculation, right? Because you look at, let's say, a place like Calgary that was once also host to a Winter Olympics. A lot of the infrastructure that was built to sort of hold those sporting events, to ski hills, to jump hills, aren't really utilized anymore. The same story happens internationally. You look at Rio that just hosted the 2016 Olympics, so it wasn't that long ago, just 8 years ago. A lot of the stadiums that were purpose-built to accommodate sort of the Olympic-sized events are being underutilized and underused. And so as a city, as a region, you kind of have to go through this risk and reward calculus on, hey, how much infrastructure does my city already have in hosting these things? How much additional infrastructure will I need to be building? And is there a life for these pieces of infrastructure after these events end?
So are there lessons that you would draw from that? I think about your Vancouver example, and there's areas in False Creek that have been developed as part of that Olympic Village and housing that would never, I don't think, have been built otherwise. And it's a beautiful community, a great community. You mentioned the Canada Line. We have the UP Express that was built for the Pan Am Games here in Toronto. But the Sea to Sky Highway was widened for the first time after decades of people complaining about what a terrible highway that was to get to Whistler, and it was finally, because of the Olympics, actually widened and improved, a major infrastructure project.
That's
And
exactly it.
my sense is that they did a good job of using existing facilities where the stadium was the location for some of the opening and closing events, the arena for a lot of the hockey, the Whistler obviously for the skiing, so that they were able to use and utilize some existing facilities, if not build facilities that would be of use longer term. So what are the lessons of holding events, major events like this, that you would draw?
Number one, it's always going to cost more than you think it will. Oftentimes, when the early discussions on bidding for these opportunities arise, you might hear sort of news stories that come from, let's say, a city estimate on how much it's going to be costing the city to host these events. It's probably wise to at least be doubling, if not tripling that number, because there's so many and sort of expected factors that you're not going to be able to control because you're committing to hosting something sometimes years in advance of when it actually happens. And so when you hear a cost estimate, you need to be doubling or tripling that. And then the second sort of lesson that I think a lot of city planners, policymakers need to be taking is actually, as you've started discussing, taking stock of existing infrastructure and figuring out what additional infrastructure you actually need to be building. Because guess what? The infrastructure is going to be there, but if it's not going to be used beyond the life of that large event, it's not going to be useful to the local economy. Massive new stadium is not going to be useful if no one can fill that stadium. And it's basically just money that is going to waste. And so you have to be realistic about the new infrastructure that you're going to be building and how long that infrastructure is going to be used for. But apart from that, I do think that one sort of consideration that so many people often forget is again the fun part, the fun aspect of hosting these events. As you saw in the Taylor Swift Olympics, or not the Taylor Swift Olympics, even though that would be a really fun event to go to, perhaps, the Taylor Swift concert. But even when the Raptors won the NBA championship in Toronto, the entire city kind of shut down and fans celebrated. That's a great energy. That's what a city should be. And these events also bring those energy. And so I would also encourage people to also not forget about the fun part, the energetic part of hosting these events as well.
I mentioned these people that I met last Saturday after the Taylor Swift, well, before and after the Taylor Swift concert, and frankly, at brunch the next morning, from Nashville, Tennessee, from Los Angeles, from San Francisco, etc. They came in on the Thursday or Friday. They maybe went to the Taylor tailgate at the convention center. They maybe walked around downtown. They went to the concert and they left again. So they didn't really see Toronto.
Yeah. So I that's I think where since writing that op-ed, I have been out on a couple of nights during the Taylor Swift concerts, thinking about whether the city has in fact done well to prepare for this event to be able to take advantage of all the opportunities that it could be. And from an organizational perspective, from the crowd control perspective, from sort of people's safety perspective, I think the city has done a fine job. It has meant that, like, even though there are a lot more people downtown on any given night, we haven't really had news stories that report about massive gridlocks that was impossible for people to get home after the concert. We haven't really had any massive security incidents, so I will give the city kudos to that. But I think you're absolutely right. One thing that made London really special was again that idea of the whole city not just embracing Taylor Swift, but also embracing Taylor Swift in its own way. The exhibit that hosted the special exhibit on Taylor Swift costumes, it made sense for that to be hosted at Victoria and Albert because it is one of the world's best sort of fashion museum that exist. And so it actually took advantage of all of those existing cultural capital and cultural asset that the city has and sort of twisted it, made it attractive to these groups of fans. And quite frankly, I haven't seen a lot of that in Toronto. I don't see the kind of special exhibit that curators at the AGO, Art Gallery of Ontario, or ROM, Royal Ontario Museum, that are putting in, that are tying into the phenomenon that is Taylor Swift. There is a small exhibit about this photojournalist from Mississauga in the Eaton Centre of her documenting different Taylor Swift tours, but it's the Eaton Centre, they don't really host those kinds of events often. That isn't really a cultural capital or the cultural asset of the city. And so I do think that the city could have done much, much more than just having a convention center host a tailgating party or themed cocktails at a brewery, but going much more on this sense of what cultural assets do we have and how can we tie Taylor Swift into it.
I agree. I think we could have done more, but I'm very glad that we didn't have any issues. And I remember, I can't even remember who it was now, but one concert performer who had to get out of his taxi and walk
Yeah.
to the
That's one
arena,
of the ex One Direction singer Niall.
who said, "I had to walk because the traffic was so bad," or something like that, right?
Yep, and we haven't heard a story like that, which I think is a very, very good thing for the city, and I will give them kudos for that.
I had a friend that went to Vienna this summer for the Taylor Swift concert. That was a catastrophe for Vienna, but also for all the individuals that bought tickets, hotels, and flights.
Yeah, and that I think continues to be one of the most shocking developments of the Eras Tour, right? Now, I'm actually really, really glad that the potential attack was thwarted, was that nobody was actually hurt because the threat was identified and the threat was apprehended. But for thousands of fans, they traveled to Vienna to see her show. And I think it was the right decision for them to shut it down because the arrest was made so close to the performance that they weren't quite sure the scale of the conspiracy, and so they couldn't really guarantee the safety of people attending it. And in fact, I actually met a couple of folks who were at Vienna when that concert was cancelled, who then ended up getting last minute tickets to London in order to at least see her in some opportunity or one or other opportunities. And there was this sense of triumph, even though they were frustrated. I actually saw an incredible sense that they understood what was happening, and there was no ill will that they sort of harbored towards Vienna or Taylor Swift or the fact that it was sort of cancelled because they knew the circumstances. And I do think that, again, tells you something about fans or Swifties and how they approach these concerts, right? Is that they perhaps see it not necessarily as a right for a Swiftie to be able to attend these concerts, but as a privilege. And sometimes stuff happens and you still count yourself lucky that you were able to be partaking in it. But I do think that event, if anything, sort of characterized how important it is for a city to take these events seriously. Because if Vienna didn't take it seriously, something bad really could have happened. I was living in the UK when the Manchester Stadium attack happened, when a terrorist attack happened in Manchester Stadium and a lot of people passed away. And being able to prevent that is again another kind of investment that you have to be making as a city.
I was again surprised when this friend of mine sent me videos and pictures of these Swifties collecting in streets and singing Taylor Swift songs
Yeah.
into the wee hours of the night, all day long, all afternoon long, all evening long. And it was as if, even though they weren't able to go to the concert, they were still gonna have a great time and get together and trade bracelets.
Yeah, and then I come back to that earlier point that I've made in the first segment of this conversation, right? Taylor Swift's Eras Tour concert is about her, but it's also about a chance for fans to participate and create big and great memories together as well. And so even if the concert isn't there, all the fans are in fact there. They can still create memories together. So much of what happens when you attend the Eras Tour is about the concert, sure, but it's also about all the interactions that you're going to be having with people that you didn't know that you're now friends with you. I think attending the London concert, I have made probably upwards of 6, 7 friends just waiting in line and being close to each other when the concert sort of started taking place. And so I do think there is something that all of us could be learning from Swifties and people who are fans of Taylor Swift is to approach life with a lot of joy, a lot of positivity. And I think we can do with a lot more of that.
No question. Well said. We're chatting with Viet Vu, who is a manager of research at Toronto Metropolitan University, but an author of a really interesting op-ed in the paper about the economic impact of Taylor Swift and also other big events. We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes with some concluding comments. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Viet Vu, who is a manager of economic research at the DIAS at Toronto Metropolitan University. We've been chatting about the economic impact of Taylor Swift and her tour on Toronto and elsewhere. But Viet, I understand that you do research into tech and some other issues, and one of them is deep fake. What the heck is that?
So deepfake is essentially a technology that was created probably about 5 years ago now that has gradually gotten better. And what that means is that through venues like this, where there are a lot of footages of us online, right? Of our faces, of how our mouth moves. And there's this AI algorithm that kind of takes all of those footages to be able to generate an entirely new set of videos that kind of resemble you, but isn't actually anything that you yourself recorded, and perhaps you saying things that you never said. And so the idea of a deep fake, because it is faked content, but the faked aspect of it is so deep that a lot of people have trouble sort of telling apart what is true and what is not true anymore. And so there could be a version of this conversation where I'm actually saying that Taylor Swift sucks because there's enough footage of my face and my mouth moving. And so they know how to make the images move so that my mouth is instead saying Taylor Swift sucks. And so that's what deepfake is.
And you do research on this?
Absolutely. And the interesting thing, I'm not going to say funny because it was actually a really terrible thing, is that there is in fact a Taylor Swift angle on this as well. One of the most damaging thing about deepfake, there are a couple of damaging things that relate to things like, election misinformation and polluting our information ecosystem overall. But one of the most personally damaging thing that deepfake can do is that it can generate intimate images of yourself, images of yourself that are engaging in, let's say, sexual acts that you definitely did not record, and those materials being publicized online as a way to harm individuals and hurt people, perhaps as a form of a revenge on someone's behalf. And Taylor Swift was actually a victim to this fact. A couple of months ago, there were images of her attached to a body that wasn't her, that wasn't wearing any clothes, that were sort of disseminated on Twitter. Now, the images were quickly taken down, but it kind of shows you how damaging this technology can be, even for someone who we think of as having all the money in the world and all the power and privilege in the world. And she actually was a signatory to this sort of public letter towards the US Congress to try to regulate this technology. Because quite frankly, no one, not a single person, should be experiencing what Taylor Swift experienced. And yet we have a lot of people who do get hurt because those sort of deep faked intimate images themselves are leaked online or shared online. And so there is, I think, a lot of room for us to be regulating this and creating the right governance structure around this technology.
And are these some of the issues that you research?
Absolutely. So in Canada right now, there's actually a bill that is going through Parliament right now. We'll see if it survives an election that might or might not be coming up. But the bill essentially is called an online harms bill that broadly talk about this harmful behavior online that goes beyond the idea of deepfake, but also things like bullying and harassment and hate speech And it might sound draconian at first, but I do think that the Canadian approach, especially as it relates to the online harm aspect of it, because the bill actually has two components. The component that I'm most familiar with is the online harms aspect of it, isn't about regulating and forcing platforms to be deleting sort of content that isn't approved or that isn't deemed to be legal. Instead, it essentially approaches a problem from an internationally recognized approach called a risk-based approach, which focus much more on how do you design a platform to limit those kinds of harmful behavior. How do you actually identify when those harmful behavior happens and then kind of address it, but not necessarily by default removing the material. Now, there are some material, like let's say child sexual exploitation material that should be illegal, that already is illegal, that this bill also address as a you just got to remove those things. But there's so much of these harmful interaction that happens online that could be technologically aided or could just be a crappy human being expressing their opinion online that exist on that borderline that you can't quite agree with the fact of outlawing it, but you also know that it is hurting someone out there. And so the bill essentially creates a commissioner whose role is to ensure that every sort of social media platform, large ones, has policies in place and actually consider experience sort of online harm and how they design the platform. And so it's much more on that risk-based and design perspective as opposed to being punitive, which I think is a really positive thing.
Thanks for that. That was an interesting discussion. I got to ask you one last question before I go.
Please.
You're obviously a very smart guy and a Taylor Swift fan and a culturally aware individual. I can't tell you, probably if it's not a dozen, it's 10 discussion/conversation/arguments with people over the course of the last couple of weeks when I told them that I spent an outrageous amount of money buying tickets to the Taylor Swift concert. And some people think she's a great songwriter, and other people say, you got to be kidding. What's your opinion?
I think, as I said, I think she's a really, really great singer-songwriter. I think she writes from the heart. Now, one thing that I might say that could be a tiny, tiny bit controversial, which is that I don't think her contribution from a music genre perspective is going to be as consequential as some of the artists that created entirely new genres of music. But I absolutely believe that she changed the music industry for good. Because the reality is, so many artists will, going forward, try to replicate what she had created. Her approach and her thinking on owning her own sort of content and creating and recording versions and re-releasing albums of her old songs, but now she owns all of the copyright, changes how artists approach their own intellectual property. And so I think some of the most impactful sort of moments that Taylor Swift will leave in history will actually, I think, be much more on how the industry itself operates, as opposed to the fact that her music is very good. But I do think her impact on the music industry as a whole will end up outshining her impact on music itself.
Viet Vu, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. That was an interesting op-ed and a really great conversation.
No, I had a lot of fun. Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. on 960 a.m. You can stream me online at saga960am.cl. My podcasts and videos get put up on the internet, hopefully never deep faked, at briancrombie.com. I put my podcasts on all the podcast servers and my videos on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Good night, everybody, and thank you.